The following Truth Barista podcast is a High Beam Ministry production. Hi, this is Pastor Jay Christensen. I am the Truth Barista, and I just want to have a little word to our listeners today. As you know, this is a podcast, and it's set in the imaginary coffee shop called the Ersatz Coffee Shop, which is a word that means fake. And we just try to set up this scenario for the fun of creating theater in the mind. But it is a podcast that we hope goes across the world and speaks to many, many people. And you know, if you are excited about this podcast, we would really like to hear from you. So send us an email with your questions, suggestions, and comments to thetruthbarista@gmail.com. And you can rewind this and get that again, thetruthbarista@gmail.com. You can go to truthbarista.com, or you can go to High Beam Ministry, all one word, highbeamministry.com, to get recent updates, episodes, writings, resources, all sorts of stuff. Now, we'd like you to join Amazing Larry, who is my imaginary kitchen help, and
That's
myself, and we're going to continue our study in eschatology, end times things, markers, and signs. You ready to go? And here we are.
We'll make this quick. No one truly knows how long we really have left.
It's the apocalypse, end of days, the judgment day, the end of the world, my friend.
It's a threat of biblical proportions.
What do you mean, biblical?
What he means is Old Testament, Mr. Mayor. Real wrath of God type stuff.
Exactly.
Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies. Rivers and seas boiling.
40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes, the dead rising from the grave.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
Welcome to the Ersatz Coffee Shop. This is Jay, your Truth Barista, and I'm serving up a steamy cup of God's truth for the average Joe. You can catch me and this podcast on my websites, truthbarista.com, all one word, truthbarista.com, and highbeamministry.com. That's HIGHBEAM ministry.com, as in car high beam. We're shining the light of God's truth on the road ahead.
Truth Barista, we're back into the scriptures, and we're going to talk about these markers and these signs. We're going to talk about Daniel, and maybe even talk about Jesus a little bit as it evolves into when he comes into the timeline. So,
right,
where do we start?
Okay, eschatology, the study of end times. We need to understand these things because we are in a process, and God is going to restore that which was lost. It's the succession of empires. Nebuchadnezzar was worried about himself. God goes, hey, let me tell you about yourself, Nebuchadnezzar. And by the way, let me throw in the rest of human history as well, all the way to the point where God's kingdom shows up. So he goes, the gold head is Babylon, the silver arms and chest are the Medo-Persian Empire, the bronze torso, which will follow, we find out, is the Greeks. Then you and I talked about the iron legs and the mixed feet could be the Roman Empire and a revived Roman Empire, or it could be an Islamic empire and a revived Islamic empire called the Caliphate, and a stone not cut with hands, meaning it's from God, of God, comes down, smashes the succession of kingdoms, ends that train of dominion on earth, sets up his kingdom, and all other dominions on earth become subject to the one kingdom. You got it? Was that a good summary?
Oh, that was fabulous.
Okay.
I love that whole idea of the stone not cut by hands, because that really does talk about Jesus, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And we find out later that, yeah, that is Jesus. He is the stone, the foundation stone, not cut with hands. So jump to Daniel chapter 7 here. Okay, now we're going to look at some of the markers and some of the process. Now you got to remember, like the telescope, a lot of this stuff is crunched together. Now, I'm going to give you a summary of chapter 7. In chapter 7, Daniel is getting a vision himself, a dream and vision, as he was lying in his bed, verse 1, and he wrote it down, and he sees these beasts on earth. Now, beasts are just another form of these empires, and so they correlate with the various parts of the statue. So the first one was verse 4, like a lion, but had eagle's wings. Okay, that one becomes equated with Babylon. Verse 5, a second one looked like a bear. It raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth. That is the Medo-Persian Empire, because people say that one side is bigger than the other, while the Persian Empire was greater than the Medo side of the empire. Verse 6, another beast appeared. It was like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back, had 4 heads, given authority to rule. That is very clearly the Greek Empire, because once Alexander died, it was split into 4 between 4 generals. But this is the one that's interesting. Verse 7, while I was watching in the night visions, a 4th beast appeared, frightening and dreadful and incredibly strong, with large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed, and it trampled with its feet whatever was left. Now, I'm not going to get into the horns and that kind of stuff, because that's kind of muddies it up. But the nature of this beast is, it is so terrible that it destroys everything in its path. It is all about itself, destroys everything in its path, tramples what's left. I mean, it's its way or nothing. This is the thing that makes me to believe that it's not the Roman Empire, but an Islamic empire. Because under the Roman Empire, they were content to let people be and to worship as they would. All you had to do is make sure you offered a little pinch of incense to the emperor, and you just did things Rome's way, and everything's cool. Now, if you ticked off Rome, Rome's military was so strong that it was the fighting force of the day, and you did not want to come up against the Roman Empire. But the empire itself, the nature of the empire, was kind of like, we're all going to get along to get along. Just, recognize the emperor's head and everything's cool. That's the way it was for hundreds of years.
But wasn't the Roman Empire one of the most prolific conquering empires in history?
Yes, it was. But once it conquered, the nature was simply, you can be who you are, just work with the empire. The difference is in the Islamic Empire, it literally has this 4th beast's nature. It is, as you see it over time, Islam means submission. And the point of the Islamic Empire and the, sad to say, the history of the Islamic Empire is total domination. It moves into an area, it wipes out all religious competition. It would move into an area, it would wipe out political competition. It is its way or no way. And by the way, I'm speaking in broad terms here, but this is the history from the 600s onward. It was advanced by the sword, it was maintained by the sword, and all you have to do is point to the dimitude or servant or slave laws. You either paid a tax to be left alone, or you converted, and in some cases, you didn't pay the tax, you either converted or died, which really fits the prophetic view of an end-time empire of, you will either serve the beast or you will die. Okay, so I'm throwing that out there. Okay, so what happens is, this beast is not just a beast, it is a beastly beast, this final beast. Now, according to chapter 7, it says a horn, and a horn in Jewish thinking is a picture of a king, somebody who has authority or power. I mean, where does the power of the ox reside? In its horns, if you've ever been gored, right? David says, Lord, you have lifted my horn above the nations. In other words, you've exalted my kingship above the nations. Well, this horn manifests on this terrible beast, this beastly beast, and it begins to speak against God. Now, the picture flips to heaven in verse 9, and you see the Ancient of Days, God the Father, sitting on his throne. You see a bunch of others sitting around him, and one like a son of man, a divine human, steps forward, and that's in verse 13, approaches the Ancient of Days, and here's the key, verse 14. He was given authority to rule and glory and a kingdom, so that those of every people, nation, and tongue or language should serve him. Isn't that interesting? Because in the book of Revelation, God constructs his kingdom of people from every nation, tribe, and tongue. Exact same language. Now look at this. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. This is the kingdom of the rock, not cut with hands, that will grow into the kingdom of God that will never end. Now we jump back down to earth in verse 15. He wants the true meaning. Well, as he was watching, verse 21, this horn, this beastly king of the beastly beast, waged war against the holy ones and was prevailing over him until the Ancient of Days arrived, and a judgment was given in favor of the holy ones of the Most High for the time to come, and the holy ones took possession of the kingdom. And basically what he's saying is the beast rises up on the earth, this kingdom, takes dominion, tramples and crushes everything in its path. At the same time, a divine human, a son of man figure, comes forward to receive all dominion on earth from the Ancient of Days. He will come down, destroy the beast, and establish God's kingdom. Does that sound like anything we have just talked about? Yes. Daniel chapter 2. This is the rock that's going to destroy the succession of human kingdoms and set up God's kingdoms. So what do you think about that?
Well, I just think it's so revealing of what God has planned. It's all here, isn't it?
This is the foundation of all of this end times thing. It's all about establishing God's kingdom on earth as it was. It's really not about anything else. Okay, now you go to chapter 8. Now you get Daniel's vision of the end. So he sees, again, he gets his pictures in terms of animals, and I'll let you read through that stuff, but I want to point out here that, let's start at verse 15. So he gets to all of this happening here. Now let's go back to verse 13. Daniel sees all this action between these animals representing these kingdoms and the horns representing these kings. Actually, I'm going to go back to verse 9. From one of them, a little horn emerged and grew extensively toward the south and the east and toward the beautiful land. That is referring to Israel. It grew as high as the heavenly host and made some of the stars and some of the host fall to earth and trampled them. This is a very pictorial way of saying that this final king of this beastly beast takes down the leaders. Verse 11, it made itself great even up to the prince of hosts. In other words, it exalts itself even up to God. It removed his daily sacrifice and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Now, this is fascinating because in 165 BC, Antiochus IV of this empire is actually a picture of this. He attacked Israel. He's part of the Greek Empire. He attacked Israel. He stopped the daily sacrifice, and he desecrated the temple. Now,
was that the one that put pigs and stuff in the
Yeah, he
the
sacrificed a pig on the altar to desecrate the temple. And he caused many of God's holy ones, the Jews, to capitulate and say, you don't get to study Torah anymore. You don't get to circumcise your children, etc. In other words, it is my way or the highway. That's the key. But a rebellion rose up against him, and they put him down. Verse 13, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the speaker, how long will the events of this vision last? The daily sacrifice, the rebellion that desolates the temple area, and the giving over the sanctuary and the host to be trampled. Verse 14, he said to me, 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored. That's 3.5 years. Keep that in mind. Now, what I want to tell you about this, and then we'll break for coffee, this daily sacrifice is really an important sacrifice. This was a lamb that was sacrificed at 9 o'clock in the morning and another sacrifice at 3 in the afternoon. It opens the sacrificial service and it closes the sacrificial service. It was called the Tamid, or the daily. This was a sacrifice that was given to bring Israel up in remembrance before God and for Israel to remember which God they served. So it is important. You cannot have the other sacrifices unless the Tamid is first offered. Then you go through the sacrificial service, then you close the service with the Tamid, the other half of the Tamid. Isn't it interesting that Jesus was put on the cross at 9 o'clock in the morning when the Tamid sacrifice was made, and he died at 3 in the afternoon when the second Tamid sacrifice. Jesus is the sacrifice that brings Israel up in remembrance before God and reminds Israel whose God they serve.
I have just never heard that before, and I doubt it if a lot of people have. That is so good.
So this is the significance of this. What this king of this beast is doing is saying to Israel, I am denying you, your God. I will be God in his place, and I am taking you from him.
I've got to grab a cup of coffee on that one.
Yeah, process that one for a while over your espresso.
The sky is falling! The sky is falling!
What's cooking?
They think the sky is falling. This is our chance to scare them out.
Do you think end of the world is near?
All that's going on in the world today, are we living in the end times? Are these the last days? Is the world coming to an end? What does the Bible have to say about this?
Truth Barista, you know, we're living in such turbulent times with this coronavirus. What advice would you have for our audience?
Well, the first thing, you have to not give in to fear, right? I mean, you listened to a recent Dennis Prager.
Yes, and he was saying some wonderful things. Don't waste this time, but contact your friends by phone or by Skype and talk to them and your family. Do things that you haven't done for years. Do things together as a family in your own home, but do something productive and don't sit and mope and get depressed by what you hear on the news.
So on the negative side, don't give in to fear, right? That means we have to limit our consumption of the news, consumption of social media. Now, we don't want to be uninformed. We want to be informed, but man, talk about Debbie Downers, and stay away from the people who are being uber sensational about this and just stoking the fires. We don't need this. It is what it is, okay? It's like a pandemic, like a flu-type pandemic, although it has different characteristics. But, and this is the point I'd like to make too, is admittedly and apparently this has a high infection rate. So if we lower the possibility of infection, we'll have a lower potential for spread, and that will lower the severe number of cases and even deaths, and lower the strain on the hospitals so that they can keep pace and give proper care for those who need it. So really the positive thing is this is a great opportunity, like you said, to stay at home, stay in the neighborhood. I've seen a lot of people walking their dogs, hanging out with their kids, gardening already, doing some fantastic things. And you know what's the most important thing for us? You gotta stay in the coffee and you gotta stay in the Word.
What a great combination. Thanks for that encouragement, Truth Barista.
And don't forget to listen to the past episodes of the Truth Barista.
Great thought.
All right. So have you processed all of that?
Well, you know, I'm going to have to just look at this and relook at it.
Okay, good. So we're in chapter 8, and Daniel's trying to understand this, but he hears a voice talking to him. And it says to this angel, hey, Gabriel, fill Daniel in on what's going on here. Seriously, verse 16. So verse 17, so he approached where I was. This is Gabriel, the angel, right? He came near. I was terrified and fell face down. Son of man, he said to me, understand the vision refers to the time of the end. In other words, this king and Antiochus did it in 165 BC, 165 years before Jesus. But this angel says this is going to happen again at the end. Antiochus is setting the picture, but it's going to happen at the end. Why? Because the end didn't happen when Antiochus did it 165 years before Jesus. So Gabriel goes on and he begins to explain all of this stuff regarding what's going to happen. I won't get into all of this. He will cause deceit to prosper through his cunning and by his influence, and in his own mind he will make himself great. In other words, this king is going to exalt himself. He will destroy many in a time of peace. He will even stand against the Prince of Princes. In other words, he's going to set himself up against God's Messiah. Yet he will be shattered, not by human hands. Does that sound like a rock not cut by human hands?
Yeah, that's so good.
It's all there. You just have to find it, right?
So let me come back to the idea that taking the sacrifices away, does that happen again in 70 AD or is it later than that?
Aha. You're absolutely right, because the temple was reestablished after Antiochus defeated and then later died. But then the Romans came in AD 70. Jesus refers to that. That also stopped the sacrifices. But if all of this pertains to an end, that must mean that somehow this sacrifice must take place again somewhere in the end. The sacrifice is a marker. The ending of the sacrifice is a marker. It's not a sign. The fact that somehow this sacrifice will be allowed to happen again in the end days is a sign that the end is either approaching or here. The actual sacrifice itself will mark the beginning or the middle or the end, whatever, but we'll get there, of the end times. But you're absolutely right. In fact, Jesus does point that out later as a definite marker. I like verse 26 in chapter 8. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. Now you must seal up the vision because it refers to many in the days in the future. In other words, they gave Daniel the understanding, but Daniel didn't get the full understanding. And in fact, it won't get the full understanding until we hit the very last days. When Rome took down the temple, even then the full understanding, even though it seemed to match the pattern, we didn't get the full understanding. Why? It wasn't the last days. It wasn't the end. But isn't it fascinating that Peter said, this is that which Joel said, chapter 2, in Joel and Acts, the Holy Spirit is the marker of the last days. It wasn't long after Pentecost, about 40 years, that the temple was taken down. This is why many in Judaism thought the Messiah was coming at that time, but he didn't. So now we have to adjust our theology. If it didn't happen at that time, then there has to be a sacrifice in the future. That sacrifice, the Tamid, has to be stopped, and somehow a beastly kingdom has to arise, being led by a beastly king. And those are the markers we need now to look for. Okay, are you following me so far?
I am. I really am.
Let me do a quick recap here because I covered a lot of territory.
Yes, you did.
Okay, so what are some of these markers that Daniel is talking about? There will be a final kingdom. It will be a beastly kingdom, but it's not a beastly kingdom. It is a very beastly kingdom. It will trample everything in sight. So there's a marker. There's going to be a king who's going to rise over this kingdom. He is going to be a very beastly king. His nature will be the same nature as his kingdom. The picture of him we find in Antiochus IV, who stopped a sacrifice in the temple called the daily that's required for all of the other sacrifices to be done. It's the bookend sacrifice, 9 in the morning, 3 at night. He stopped that sacrifice. That's a marker. And he desecrated the temple. That's a marker. So Daniel gets the prophecy. Antiochus fulfilled it. As we'll find out, Jesus says, yes, this is going to happen as it happened. And it's going to happen again. So not only did it happen after Daniel's day in 165 BC, in a sense it happened AD 70, but Jesus says at the very end it's going to happen as it happened with Antiochus. Those are firm markers. And it all comes about on this conflict between two kingdoms. It is a showdown between the final human, in-your-face, prideful, I'm doing this my darn way kingdom, led by a king who is also vicious, versus the king who is being sent by the Ancient of Days, a rock not cut with hands, to establish God's kingdom on earth.
So that last days king, let's just call him the Antichrist, he actually does the same thing when he walks into the temple and stops the sacrifice, right?
Yep.
I mean, that is really what you're talking about.
Right. The sacrifice on the Temple Mount is a declaration of God's ownership over Israel and Israel's allegiance to God. This king says, no, I own the world. I own the people, and I am taking their allegiance from you by hook or by crook, and they are going to be mine, and God's going to go, okay, I've had it. It's time.
Well, the Jews at that point will obviously know that that isn't correct.
Right. Yeah, I believe that at this point, there will be many people who will be deceived into thinking that this final kingdom and this final king is good because, hey, peace. Who doesn't want world peace? Who doesn't want a solution to the Mideast problems and the wars, the nuclear wars that could be launched because of the various conflicts within the Middle East? And people will embrace it. But you're going to find out about halfway through, and we're going to talk about this, when all of this is stopped, when we hit the markers, that this guy is totally opposite of what they thought. He is not just a false Messiah. That's not what anti means. Anti means against. He will stand against the Father. He will stand against the Son. And that's what we're looking at here. Okay, got it?
Oh, it's so good.
Okay, now I'm going to finish in chapter 9 here. Okay, I'm just going to give you the upshot here, and I'll let you read through some of this stuff, but I'll mention the verses as we go. So, in chapter 9, Daniel gets an angelic visit and another message from Gabriel. What he gets in this one is unique. God says he's got a 70-week plan, and it says in verse 24, to bring the rebellion to an end, to put a stop to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, in other words, to bring it all to a close, and to anoint the most holy place. In a nutshell, what God is saying is to Daniel, okay, Daniel, take a seat, grab a cup of coffee. I'm going to unveil my 70-week plan that is going to wrap up all of this junk that's been happening on the earth and to set everything right again. Make sense to you?
It does.
It is a 70-week plan to restore earth to the way it was in Genesis 1 through 2. The specific markers are these that he reveals. He says, Daniel, between two markers, there will be a 69-week period. Now, he calls them a week of years. So in other words, it's 69 times 7 years. And he says this is the time period that will elapse between some markers. What are the markers? It says very, very clear in verse 25a, from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, there's a marker. And the other marker is also 25a, until an anointed one. An anointed one in Hebrew means Mashiach, the Messiah. So in other words, between the time of the marker of issuing the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem and the Messiah, it will be 69 weeks of years. He says, then the anointed one will be cut off. In other words, he's going to be killed. He's going to be eliminated. In our view, he's gone, right? And it says clearly there, that will mark the end of the 69 week of years period. Now, we're not counting the years of Jesus' life. We're just saying between the issuance and Messiah's coming, that's a 69 week of years, and Jesus' death on the cross marks and confirms that, yes, he was the anointed one that ended that 69 weeks of years. Okay, so then what happens? What about that last week of years, which is a 7-year period? It's saying that the plan between 69 and 70 is going to move into a holding pattern for a time until someone makes a firm covenant with many for a week. There's another marker. Are you writing these in your Bible?
I am. I'm circling and underlining.
Okay, if you have to write it, write it. So marker number 1, the issuing of the decree. Marker number 2, the appearance of the Messiah confirmed by his cutting off. Marker number 3 is the beginning of another covenant that parallels the 7 weeks that will mark the beginning of the final week. That starts the prophetic time clock leading up to God's kingdom, which is really exciting because if that starts it, you know God's going to stop it.
There's a term people use for the 7 years, though, don't they?
They call it the tribulation.
Ah.
There you go. Now, there's another marker here. It says that this covenant that he starts that signals the beginning of this 7-year period, the final 7-year countdown, he's going to break it halfway through. So at the 3.5-year point, boom, there's another marker. All right? So the start of the last week of years is marked with a covenant. Halfway through this final week, the 3.5 years in, the covenant will be broken, marked by the stopping of sacrifice and offering and some sort of an abominable act that appalls people. By the way, that's what abominable means. It appalls people, and it desolates and desecrates the temple or the Temple Mount precincts. Isn't this fascinating that this is exactly what Antiochus IV did? He made a covenant with the people. He came in, he stopped the sacrifice, and 3.5 years later, he was done with. It was all cleared out, and they purified the temple. They rededicated. This is why we have the Feast of Hanukkah. The Feast of Dedication comes from this. It's a celebration of people rededicating the temple to God. By the way, if the events of Antiochus IV, the persecution and the rededication is so important at this time, maybe learning to celebrate Hanukkah would be very important for the people in the last 3.5 years of the tribulation, because it marks the exact same type of thing. Aha! Okay, so here we go. This chapter actually gives us more detail regarding God's plan than chapter 2, 7, and 8. You need to put it all together. So here's the summary. There will be 69 weeks of years from the first marker, the decree, until Messiah, the Anointed One. Then Jesus arrives, signaling the end of the first period of time, and his death confirms it. Then an uncounted period of time will elapse before the final 7-year countdown to the end of humanity's dominion on earth and the start of God's everlasting kingdom comes in. The final 7-year period is marked with a covenant. The midpoint of the breaking of the covenant is also the marker, and the marker of the marker is the stopping of the sacrifices, or in fact you could say the sign of the marker is the stopping of the Tamid on the Temple Mount, and another sign of the marker is something that desolates or desecrates or defiles the Temple Mount. We're going to find out what that is in a bit. Now, in chapter 11, you get insights about the supernatural and divine being, about the final nature of this beastly human ruler and his actions, and in chapter 12, here we go. We'll get our final markers and our final signs from Daniel. It says, "At that time, Michael, the great prince who stands watch over your people," in other words, the archangel Michael watches over Israel specifically. "He will rise up. There will be a time of distress such as never occurred since nations came into being until that time." So, in this final week, the marker is, it starts with a covenant. The sign is a beastly kingdom will arise with a beastly king. The sign of this will be a terrible time for the world such as it's never seen. And we'll talk about that in the next one. By the way, think about how the horrors that the world has experienced over times and realize they pale in comparison with what's coming. The beastly king will oppose God and will viciously attack his people, both Jews and Christians. But his end is sure, because the stone not cut with hands, Jesus will return. He will put down the kingdom. He will destroy that king, that beastly king, and all those who are with him. And then Jesus will set up his Father's kingdom on earth. He will seal up all prophecy and vision. And that will be the end as we move into God's kingdom.
Wow, was that a story or what?
What a panorama of prophecy.
And when we started the series, you said something about a lot of pastors or a lot of Christian leaders will not teach this. And so how much of this are we missing in terms of discerning what God's plan may be for us?
A lot. And what we're left with is guessing and speculation. But what we have to understand is this is unsealed through the illuminating work of the Holy Spirit, but it also requires intellectual work. Pastors have to understand the Jewish context that the scripture was written in, because if you don't understand the significance of the Tamid sacrifice, all of a sudden you might see Jews on the Temple Mount, say around the Feast of Trumpets or leading up to the Days of Atonement and the fall feasts. All of a sudden Israel says, hey, there's a guy who's convinced the Muslims to allow the Jews to have a Tamid sacrifice on the Temple Mount, and they get to do it, and there's such an uprising that they say, nope, stop it, it's all done. Guess what, folks? You've just blown past a major marker and a major sign, and you will not realize that you are in the tribulation.
I can't wait till next week.
This is Jay, your Truth Barista. Thanks for listening to the Truth Barista podcast.